Recording. There we go.
Okay. All right. So again, I am Tina, and Holly was the original content creator but could not present with us today. So again, if you did have any questions about the content or questions about scoping reviews in general, or other type of reviews, we're happy to answer those questions. And hopefully you'll get a chance to see some of our other videos and webinars in this series. So here is our agenda for today. We're going to start with, an overview of what are scoping reviews and what are the characteristics of scoping reviews and how are they different from things like systematic reviews, which are very closely related to. And then we'll go through the scoping review process. And we'll end up with how do you work with a librarian on a scoping review? What does that look like? And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. And as an important note, scoping reviews are large projects, very much. I'll be comparing them to systematic reviews actually quite a bit in this webinar. So this is meant to be an introduction. It's not possible to cover everything I could possibly tell you about a scoping review in the 45 minutes that we're going to probably have together. So if you're interested in scoping reviews, you think you might be doing one, it's best to contact us and sit down and talk about your project in detail. We also have lists of resources and things that we can give you to dig into scoping reviews and other evidence synthesis projects in detail. This is just meant to be the broad sweeping big picture of this type of work. So let's talk about a definition. A scoping review in a very simple term is typically a preliminary assessment of a potential size and scope of available research, literature research. And it looks to identify the nature and extent of evidence that would be out there, and it includes ongoing research as well. So it is trying to get the scope of research that is out there. This can include things like gray literature, and it's including, a systematic or systematized search in databases, and it's going to include or potentially include research that's in progress. So it is a very broad, sweeping, very open search that is trying to encompass a lot of different things. So it tends to be very large, and they tend to be very I don't want to say nebulous, but their borders and how they're defined can be fuzzy if they want to be. Unlike a systematic review, where those borders have to be extremely well defined and curtailed, right? You have some latitude in scoping reviews that you don't have elsewhere sometimes. The question you have to ask yourself, as you go into scoping reviews is, are you sure you need to be doing a scoping review? Because they are but there are other types of reviews. There's lots of different types of reviews. You might be needing to do a systematic review. You might be needing to doing an umbrella or a general narrative review, things like that. If you have not seen the previous webinar in this series, we actually go in depth into different types of reviews. And there's also a few research articles that are written about the different types of reviews and when and how you would use different reviews. So if you haven't seen that webinar, you can go back and look at that on our YouTube channel. Also, if you want to look at it, you can go to our systematic review guide. There is a couple of articles on the different types of reviews or typologies of reviews, and those are linked there about the different types of reviews as well. And you can get an idea of when or where you might need a scoping review. And we're going to go a little bit further into that in the next couple of slides. But let's say you're pretty sure that you want to use a scoping review. You've looked at those articles, you've seen the other webinar. So let's talk about that a little bit further. You know, what are those scoping review characteristics that define, you know, what a good scoping review is and what makes a scoping review actually a scoping review as opposed to a systematic review, for example. So a little bit further into that definition. And this is from Peters fairly recently. Scoping reviews can be used to map key concepts. And they're a lot of times used to clarify definitions. We see that a lot where people come into our office and they see something that is not well defined, especially in institutions like ours, where they're like, people are talking about, or, you know, on the cutting edge of research, and we haven't determined yet how to define something or where the boundary exists in a treatment or a mode of care, or what even some of the options for care are. It's not as well defined as we would think. And so you are trying to figure out what that conceptual boundary is in a topic, because people are talking about it slightly different ways, or the practice implementation and how people choose to implement practice is very broad. And so there is a very broad scope in how people choose to write about their topics and share their research around what they're doing in their practice, what they're doing in their research and things like that. And so when you go search for that literature, you have to cast a very, very wide net. And scoping reviews then have to have that broad scope in order to capture all that literature. And so they have less restrictive inclusion criteria, and they draw upon data and sources and evidence and research methodologies that are also broad as well. So systematic reviews, by contrast, have narrower inclusion criteria. They are typically things that have to pink lady apples. Because we all know if we go to the grocery store, there's 6 gazillion different types of apples these days. It's not enough to say that you are comparing apples to apples. You have to be very specific about the type of apple that you are comparing. And that is true within systematic reviews. So when you're doing that kind of thing, you have to be very specific about the type of intervention, the way that they're measuring their outcomes, things like that. You don't have that in a scoping review. You don't need that in a scoping review necessarily. So you do have these broader looks at how the research is written and how you look for the research and what you can include. So why do them? Why do them? They can be monsters that way. A lot of people use them from a very pragmatic way to determine whether or not a systematic review is feasible or practical. Systematic reviews in and of themselves, because of that inclusion criteria and because all of the rigor that goes into them, and the work that goes into them, you have to determine whether or not there's even literature enough and the right kind of comparators and interventions and all that stuff to even warrant doing it. There's nothing worse than getting down that path and then finding out that you don't have enough literature to even work with, and it all falls apart. So a lot of people will do a scoping review to determine if it's even worthwhile. But secondary to that, a lot of people do them to just identify types of evidence that are in the field. What are people doing? What, are people doing CAPES reports? Are they doing observational studies? Are there randomized controlled trials that are doing interventional studies and doing comparisons? What is out there? What types of evidence are they doing on this topic to identify things? Other people do them to identify knowledge gaps. What do and don't we know about a given topic? Where do we exist with that? There's a lot, and I've mentioned this passively before, but how are people talking about concepts, definitions, things like that? If we gather all the literature in a scoping review, we can do a synthesis to figure out how different researchers, different practitioners are applying these definitions and using them in practice and research. Similarly, we can also look at, how research is conducted in and of itself. How research is conducted or how practice is conducted. I'm currently assisting a group on a scoping review where they are looking at harm reduction and low barrier modalities for buprenorphine treatment that doesn't include hospital settings. Where non-hospital settings, how are people doing it? Like, they just want to look and see how are people doing it that are just non-clinics. And so you have to cast a really wide net to do that. There's no real good language for searching for that. So a scoping review is it to kind of figure that out. And, similarly identifying like key characteristics or factors related to concepts. That's similar to, analyzing knowledge gaps or key concepts and definitions to things. Sometimes things have been identified, but sometimes you want things that are also adjacent to it. Sometimes we know something, but there's this item that works in tandem with it. And that necessarily hasn't been identified. There's things that kind of go together. And there's other reasons besides this, right? Lots of people do systematic reviews or scoping reviews for reasons like these, but these are the ones that we see that are fairly common reasons for doing scoping reviews. I see a question in the chat really quick. Okay. There wasn't a direct question. Somebody that, okay. If you are having, no worries. If you're having trouble with any audio or technical issues, please direct message Emily while you're here, and we'll make sure that we sort that out if we can. And then if there's any issues, just let me know if I need to back up or repeat anything, okay? Are we good? Yes, okay. All right. All right then. Just get back to my slides. Okay. So if that's why we're doing a scoping review, then these are some of the components of a scoping review. The thing that all of these revolve around is that, like in systematic reviews, the process needs to be both transparent and replicable. Scope reviews are big projects because of the nature of what we've already described. They're broad. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces to them. There's a lot to keep track of. And so with that, these are a few of the elements and the components that kind of go into them. Starting at the top, the question generally, but not always, follows PCC, which we're going to go into in the PCC framework, which is patient population, context, and because this webinar, I'm just blanking in the last one. I've got it written out in the next slide. But it's a framework for searching. It's a framework for conceptualizing your research question and compartmentalizing the different aspects that you're going to look at, context. But it's contextualizing what you're looking for. Going clockwise around the circle, you also do want a systematic, comprehensive search. You can't synthesize what you haven't captured. So if you don't have a systematic, comprehensive search, then you can't retrieve things in order to analyze them. So that is still a foundational element to this. And it's a foundational element to a lot of different evidence synthesis practices. Yes, population concept and context. Thank you, Emily. So if you don't have a systematic search strategy to it, you're not going to retrieve what you need in order to get the results that you want. You still do also need inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now, these criteria don't necessarily need to be as rigorous as a systematic review necessarily. They may be broader and looser than what you might have in a systematic review. You have latitude there, but you still do need to have them. You do need to have boundaries on what is considered necessary for things like that. There is an extraction process. So once you found the literature that you need, then you need to have some sort of idea of what data points that you want to take from those articles that you then will synthesize and summarize in order to discuss and present in tables or figures or whatever is appropriate for the research question that you're trying to address. And that goes into that synthesis of your included studies, which then, of course, hopefully would get published. But again, there's lots of different ways that publishing happens. We can go the traditional publishing route, but sometimes scoping reviews, because of the nature, they can be very large, and sometimes they are grant funded. Some of these scoping reviews end up being very, very large projects that end up as white papers that foundations publish and things like that. So there's a couple of different routes for things like that. But let me stop right there. This is, some of that background of what a scoping review is and some of its characteristics. We're going to go into the process next, but does anybody have any questions here before I go into that process step? Either by chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, that's totally fine too.
A quick question. What does PCC elements mean again?
Population, concept, and context. We're going to go into that in the process.
Okay.
Yeah, quick question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very, very wonderful presentation so far. So I guess my question has to do with mixed study review in the context of scoping review. So where does that fit in? So you're attempting to do a scoping review, but you have to think about, you have your quant studies and your core studies, and you want to sort of integrate that in a mixed study context. Can you speak a little bit to that? Does that fit in on that scoping review as well?
Yes, you can mix qualitative and quantitative in a scoping review. It has to do with, you have to link that back to the research question that you're trying to answer. Without having a research question at hand, it's hard to kind of give an example of how that would work. But And it is possible to quantify that. Scoping reviews can have quantifiable aspects to them where you report out on numbers and outcomes and things like that, but also have qualitative aspects to them where you have more of a discussion of what you're seeing in the nature of what that is. So some of that falls into how do you want to structure the scoping review relative to the research question. And when you've brought all of that data in through all of these different studies, you know, that goes into the organization of the paper itself, right? And in that bit of like, how do you organize your data and what did you bring in versus how do you want to synthesize it and then put it back out? I realize that's kind of a vague answer. It's really specific to the research question that you have. And what's the best way to kind of present that data that you've then synthesized and analyzed? But it is possible to do it. People do it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay. Let's get into process because I think some of that might also help that out a little bit. Let me get out of I was monitoring chat too. Okay, so minimize the chat box. Okay, so the scoping review process. The scoping review process does look very much like the systematic review process in terms of steps. And you'll see this little visualization. I'm going to minimize it and you'll see it just as an orientation in the top right of the slides as we go on. But the general idea is that you develop your question first. You have to have what you want in mind. And from there, everything follows. And then once you have your question, we do encourage that you write a protocol. And I'm going to go through each one of these in depth in subsequent slides. So you're going to develop a question. We do encourage that you develop a protocol. They're not just for systematic reviews. They help guide your project and help you flesh out ideas about the question itself. And the data that you're going to gather and how you're going to synthesize it, which speaks directly to the question that was just asked. Then you do your literature search and gather in all of that from a bunch of different sources. You apply your inclusion/exclusion criteria to actually select the studies that you're going to include for that review. Then you go to data extraction and analysis of those studies. And then you get to analyzing and then presenting your results. So looking at these individually. Slides are not advancing. Okay, so the average time for this whole time is about 18 months, and that is an average. So some of them take less time than that. Some of them take more time than that. It does very much depend on the amount of literature, the number of people on the team, how well that team works together, how many competing priorities that team has. Things like clinical practice and your day job gets in the way sometimes. Teaching responsibilities, personal life commitments, things like that. So it is not surprising for these things to be over 18 months pretty regularly. This is a common expectation. And like systematic reviews, scoping reviews should be done as a team. They need certain redundancies and certain steps. You know, you should have people screening, multiple screeners at the study selection points and the data extraction points, things like that. You can use software to help you through the study selection and data extraction points. In fact, you can use a lot of the same software like Covidence and RAN and things like that. So even though this is only, this webinar series is designed specifically for, systematic review, there's a lot of different webinars throughout this that will certainly apply to scoping reviews as you go along. I will be doing another one on considerations for, documentation through this whole process that would apply. And I would check out the webinars on a lot of different topics. They would still apply for scoping reviews for as you go out this series. So definitely check those out. I do also want to make a side note about meta-analysis at this point. We had the question about quantitative versus qualitative data. Every once in a while we get a question about like, well, I'm going to do scoping review and meta-analysis. No, you're not. Meta-analyses are very specific statistical analysis that happens, and that statistical analysis is very specific, and it is aligned with systematic reviews and systematic reviews only. Systematic reviews are done in such a way, like we said, pink lady apples to pink lady apples. What meta-analysis are is systematic reviews plus very specific math. They are doing very specific statistical tests that have to align with the way that systematic reviews are conducted. So a meta-analysis can only be conducted within the structure that a systematic review is performed. Now, that's not to say that a scoping review can't offer quantitative results. It can, but it is not going to be a meta-analysis. It never can. And that needs to be differentiated. A lot of people use these terms very loosely, and they kind of are not very careful with it. You can do some statistical tests and you can do some statistical analysis with these things, but you're not doing a meta-analysis if you're doing a scoping review. And editorials and journals are just as bad about incorrectly using language about this. But I do want to point it out that that's factually incorrect. Meta-analysis and systematic reviews go together, and meta-analysis can never stand alone. So with that little asterisk aside, it is possible to do quantitative statistical studies on your scoping review. It's just not this. All right. So let's talk about that research question. Scoping reviews, like I mentioned, usually use the PCC framework. There's other frameworks that you can use, but population, concept, and context. There's no specific requirements for having any kind of particular outcome or intervention. And it may not be appropriate to use PCC. That's fine. I've seen plenty of scoping reviews that don't. But an example of a PCC type research question that a scoping review would be is something like this. What types of community engagement methods have been used to encourage BIPOC groups to receive blood pressure screenings? This is a very, very open question. And oh, sorry, got ahead of myself there. Where a population of interest is, BIPOC communities, we are looking at methods of community engagement, and we want to see who has received blood pressure screenings, and how have they been encouraged to receive blood pressure screenings? 3 very broad topics. We have a defined population, but methods of community engagement could be just about anything, right? We haven't defined that, and there's no specific outcome measure either. We're not talking about, how we're going to measure that specifically, and there's no intervention either. So these are the types of questions that are really applicable toward a scoping review. We're looking to gather a large amount of literature to see what's out there. How are people engaging and solving, the question of how are we engaging with this population? How are we encouraging this group of people to get blood pressure screenings? This is a question that somebody wants an answer to. So with a question in hand, we can now look at how do we work with the protocol. And we do have a webinar specifically on protocols. I believe that is coming up, the webinar after this one. And with that protocol, what you do is you define very specifically for this scoping review, your objectives, your methods, how you're going to report out. So the databases you're going to search, your inclusion, your exclusion criteria, things like that. It allows the whole process to be transparent. And also the thing that happens in almost every single project that I've ever been on or consulted on, there is scope creep. People see things that are really interesting. As you start searching for things, you realize that this is overwhelming and there's this temptation to scale back, or if something's interesting and you want to do more. And those impulses are always really good, but do you really want to do that? Because if you do that, you know, you need to figure it out and then kind of stick a stake in the ground, because once you start the literature search process, if you alter anything, then you need to back up some steps and redo and do over if you change anything from that point on. So if you have a protocol that everybody agrees on, then everybody's on the same page. We all know how to collaborate going forward. Everybody knows their roles and responsibilities. It helps eliminate things like bias. And also, because of the time commitment, you can register the protocol. So the rest of the scientific community is aware of the fact that people are working on this. And you have that bit of professional like recognition of like, no, we kind of laid claim to this already. And we said that, you know, we can publish the protocol and the protocol can be out in the wild saying, no, we're going to do this. And this is the project that we're working on. Or you can also check and see who else has already put a protocol out there that says that they're going to do this. So if we're going to do something similar, well, maybe we need to make sure that ours is novel or different or has a different aspect to it, so that we're not encroaching on somebody else, or that we're making sure that our work is distinct enough. Things like that. And we can help you navigate all of that kind of stuff too. But a protocol can help the research team shape that scoping review. And it can help keep the boundaries intact, because 18 months is a long time. And it's easy to lose track of the direction it's going in. And that could be to its detriment by the time it gets done. And we don't want that to happen for anybody. A note about documentation. We are going to have a specific section about documentation, a webinar in a couple of weeks, but document everything. Everything. A protocol is your guide, but documentation is different. You do want to document things like administrative information, personnel, funding, you know, who's on the project, how long, everybody from student, anybody who's going to get credit for anything. Your rationale, your objectives, how that changes, different iterations, your inclusion, exclusion criteria with definitions, the study characteristics, what types of studies are you going to include, the types of publications you're going to include. Will you include abstracts or not? Some things are abstract only. Will you include posters or other types of literature that aren't just full research articles? It kind of depends on, you know, what your research question is and the type of things that you're looking for, but there's a lot of different things out there that potentially could be included. You do want sources and complete replicable search strings. We do help design those, but you want to keep copies of them, not only for what you're going to need to actually do the publication part, because most publications want those in your appendices, but search strings and searching for things these databases change from year to year, and how the searches can also change from year to year. How the databases interact with search terms can change, and sometimes they need a little bit of an update. So that's a thing. And that's just the beginning things. You want to change data collection processes, where you're storing things, how you're doing your analysis, all of the software that you use to do your analysis. There's a ton of documentation that goes into these things. You can never do too much documentation. It's just not possible. So think about that. Think about the types of documentation that you could be doing. We can always consult about all of it. And that's all of your front end prep work, right? Question, your protocol, things like that. And then once you kind of have all that set up, now we can get into finding your literature, right? This is where us as librarians can be brought into the project more actively. This is where we can help you design your search strategies and your library databases. We can help guide you on searching through gray literature, which is things like things that are produced outside of publishing channels, like government documents or clinical trials, conference papers, things like that. It also includes citation mining, which is looking forward and backward through citations. So these are looking at the reference lists of the articles that you're including. So those are the things that have been published, but then also looking at the included articles to see who else is citing them, right? So the reference list is looking at the people going backwards, but you can also look forward and see who else is citing those articles and see where that tracks backwards and forwards. So all of that is stuff that you should be including in scoping reviews. I already mentioned this, got ahead of myself. Systematic searching can be very complex. And searches must be different for each one of the databases. So like just because you do a search in PubMed, that search is not going to be the same search. And you should be doing searches in more than just PubMed. You need to pick the databases and we can help you with that selection, but PubMed is not the only place that you should be searching. That selection is based on your research question, but that search that you do not only needs to be comprehensive for the database you're in, it also needs to be translated into each individual database. We are going to have a webinar on that as well. It's in our series of how to translate these searches into individual databases. So I'm not going to go into that, but I will give you a couple of examples of a typical search that might happen in PubMed, for example, and then a scoping review that would be the comprehensive search that you need to do for PubMed. And then you need to take this right-hand search that you would do for PubMed and then translate the search into the syntax and vocabulary that would be needed, for example, in Embase or CINAHL or PsycInfo, depending on what your research question would be. So this is where we come in, usually, to help you navigate some of that. A little bit of part of that search process is the ideas of recall and precision. Recall is how much of the existing literature did you find? Did you find what was out there? But precision is how much is relevant. So a lot of times when we go into search, most people go in with the idea of precision. They want to find only what they want, right? And they don't want extra. They want to find what they need, and they want that noise to be way down. The ideal is to try to figure out how to balance those two. The ideal recall is 100%, right? We want everything that we could possibly find. We want to capture everything. But the precision of that is only 1 to 3%, right? There's a lot of noise. That's for systematic reviews. For scoping reviews, we do want to prioritize recall. over precision. There is some things that might be missed. Again, it's not a systematic review, it's a scoping review. There's some, again, latitude in how we search, and different databases and things like that. But again, you still want to be aiming toward capturing as much as you possibly can. And there is a lot of screening involved with these things as well. So it's a thing to note when you're getting into them. But screening also usually goes really fast too. And there's software to aid you in that process. The other thing that aids you in that process is a good written protocol that has clearly defined inclusion and exclusion criteria. You want to avoid subjectivity if you can. And it should be able to answer with yes, no questions. Do we include this? Do we not include this? Software is amazing at this step, and they're so easy to use. And if you have 2 screeners, it's amazing how fast you can get through that screening process. Even several thousand articles can be processed within a matter of a couple of weeks. So don't be hindered by volume. And we can train you on software. It does the blinding, it does things like that. We do have, again, part of the webinar series about working with software and things like that. And then once you get through that software part of it and that inclusion exclusion, now you can get to data extraction part. The software can help to a certain degree of data extraction and analysis. You might want to go to Excel sheets or things like that for this portion. Really kind of depends on what's appropriate for your question, but piloting is encouraged. Getting a sample of the data and doing some practice extractions with a couple of full text articles that you know will be included, and use those to determine how that extraction will go, is helpful. Again, using 2 people to independently extract data and then merge that data to make sure that you're capturing all the data elements that you want. And like was previously asked in the question, it can be qualitative or quantitative or both. The extraction forms, particularly in software, can handle numerical or qualitative formats. It can straight up copy and paste like right out of your form into the thing. It still spits it out in like an Excel format, but from there you can put that into like a qualitative data analysis if that's the kind of thing that you wanted to do. It kind of depends on what your downstream analysis and what you wanted to work with. When you get to this kind of point, we're happy to talk about, you know, what some of the options might be. We take that kind of on a case-by-case basis. We don't typically get too involved in the data analysis point, but we can point you certainly at resources, and we have a number of different books that talk about data analysis for systematic reviews and scoping reviews as well. And I believe there's a number of on-campus analysis core services that might be able to help you as well. And then when you get to this point in data analysis, now you've gotten to presenting your results. This is where your documentation is going to save you. If you've done good documentation at this point, you now have search strategies and notes that you can develop into a working document. There is a Prisma diagram and a Prisma protocol for scoping reviews. You do want reference lists for your included studies. And that Prisma guideline for scoping reviews would be helpful. When you do get that research question and protocol, it is helpful. It's not strictly necessary, but you should maybe have an idea of where you might want to publish when you're starting this out. At least have 2 or 3 ideas in the beginning and check the author guidelines. They are helpful, but rarely sufficient. Reporting guidelines are more helpful than that. Like the Prisma reporting guidelines can help you at this point in presenting your results. Those in conjunction with the journal author guidelines will probably be your best bet in presenting your results in such a way that will be clear and understandable to the scientific community of what you are trying to convey in your scoping review. So I'm going to stop there. And then if you guys want to ask a few questions, and then I'll wrap up with working with a librarian with these last like couple of minutes. And then after that, I will open up for questions. But did anybody have any specific questions about process? Get chat open here too.
We don't have anything new in the chat that I can see, at least.
Yeah, I've been hearing some dinging, but I didn't see the chat bottom. Okay. Well, I will go through working with a librarian, and then I will just open it up for general questions then. Okay, working with a librarian. I've mentioned this in a few places, but for scoping reviews and systematic reviews, we do have a couple of different tiers that we actively have. Tier 1, we work as a consultant. This is, we refer to best practices. We will meet with you one-on-one with your research group or with the PI on the project. This is more to design a search strategy in broad strokes, to train team members on searching, or to consult on citation management practices or the use of a citation manager. This is more of like manuscript acknowledgement type, is appreciated at this point for tier 1 level work that we do. This is also written out on the systematic review guide that we have. Emily, I've mentioned that a couple of times. Can we grab that and put that in the chat if you haven't already? Is that what you just put in there? She's so on top of things. She's amazing. Tier 2, a lot of times we do get more involved with systematic reviews and scoping reviews. At this point, we become co-authors on the project. And at this level, we do a lot more. We work with you to define the research question and then translate forward and backward searching, locate or advise on locating other parts of the review process. We will definitely participate in documenting the search strategy for sure, as well as documenting other parts of the methods for the final manuscript. We can advise on data management for other parts of the project and rerun search if there's updates that are needed. And authorship is expected for this type of work. This type for co-author is negotiated on a case-by-case basis as for each individual project. So if you're interested in this kind of work, go to that systematic review page. There's an intake form, or you can contact us about getting started on that kind of work, and we'll match you up with one of us that does this kind of work with things like that. We don't usually do things like inclusion, exclusion. We don't do project management. We don't supervise students or anything like that. And we don't typically do full text retrieval. That's just not the level of service. We just don't have that kind of staff here to do that volume of work that is in here. But in summary, the scoping reviews are complex, time-consuming projects, very similar to systematic reviews. They have a sequential process, and they have a lot of steps that are foundational to each subsequent step. Extensive documentation and rigor is required for scoping reviews, just like systematic reviews. We're happy to help with these. We do like doing them, and we're happy to share our expertise with you and work with you on projects like this. So we're always interested to see what kind of projects that you guys are working on. This recording and the slides for this will be made available to all of you after this webinar. These are some of the references that we have here. More references and materials are available on the systematic review guide, which was linked on the previous slide as well. And again, the next webinar in this series is talking more about protocols specifically. So what's a protocol? How do you use it? What goes into it? So that's the deep dive on how to create a protocol. That's coming up next. And if anyone has another minute, or while we are going through the Q&A, if you have time to take the evaluation for the session today, we would very much appreciate it. This is the first series that we're doing on systematic reviews. That's going to take place all semester. So we would love your feedback on whether or not we should do this series again, whether or not you found this was helpful, things like that. So I'm going to leave the evaluation link up there for everybody. And in our remaining time, I'm going to go ahead and check out the chat for questions, or if anybody would like to unmute themselves. I am open for questions, and thank you for your time. Well, thank you. I am glad that you enjoyed it. Yes, they're not a loosey-goosey version of a systematic review.
Oh my gosh, I don't know what kind of face I made when I read that, but no, they're not.
The process of writing a scoping review, and this will help. Good.
Ah, that was not the evaluation link I put in there. Sorry, but if you need it, here it is.
Yes, evaluations are helpful. Okay. I do have to shut down the webinar on time. I know there's a number of people still in the room. Does anybody have any last minute questions? I am going to stop recording.
I think someone just joined. Just so you know, we are closing out here in a minute. But the recording will be on our YouTube channel, UIC Library.